I think it's time to welcome Tess up here on the stage, and yeah, give her a big hand of applause.
Thank you. Oh, this always happens. Yeah. Oh, the mic works. That's great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to this lunch talk. I'm so excited to meet you all, and very, very nervous and excited to give this talk too. Yes. So. As mentioned, my talk is about AI and tech ethics, why you should build socially sustainable products and services. But before we begin, I'd like us to start with an exercise. Don't worry, I won't put any of you on the spot, and if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to save them for the end of the talk. For now, I'd like you all to think about an example of ethical AI, machine learning, or algorithmic products or services. And I know it's unfair, because we haven't talked about what ethics means, or even aligned on how we understand ethics yet. So this is just pulling from the back of your head kind of your own intuitive sense of an ethical AI product, an ethical machine learning product, or algorithmic service. Something where you're like, this feels just right. This feels like this is using it for good. Okay, and I'm going to give you only 30 seconds, and you can write down your idea or just store it in the back of your head. That's up to you. Your 30 seconds start now. That's 30. I hope you came up with something. No shame if you didn't. That would be a very good point as well. So to begin somewhere else, let's start out with my story. 1 year ago, I was sitting in my very lovely townhouse surrounded by beautiful plants and marble in Brooklyn, New York. I'd landed my dream job. I'd been there for a little more than a year and a half. I was working at Comcast, and I was a director of product ethics for one of the biggest tech and media conglomerates in the world, a Fortune 50 company, more than 50 million customers, almost 200,000 employees. And I was working on the thing I'd always dreamt of working on, ethics and products. How do we make more ethical products across all types of different products? And it was kind of a dream scenario. And I was 33, just had my first kid, second one on the way. So don't mind me if I'm really like sweaty and warm and lose my breath up here. And it was kind of an ideal scenario, but I couldn't really understand how I made it there, because I'm actually a very atypical person for tech. I'm actually kind of a non-tech person. People call me non-technical or atechnical all the time. Not even in trying to offend me, but just because I'm like really bad at slides and rebooting my computer every once in a while and stuff like that. So how did I land in a really technical job in a really big tech company in a pretty high position early on in my career? I took the quirkiest, weirdest, mixed up path you can imagine. And I'm going to share it from the beginning, because part of what happened when I got invited to do this talk was I was sort of immediately struck by this imposter syndrome that I know everybody gets struck by, but particularly women of color, particularly women who have a non-technical background and are working in tech and are reminded of that all the time by their tech colleagues. So I figured, I'll start out with sharing this and just playing completely open and honest with what the background does for me and where it informs what I'm talking about today. So my career followed two parallel tracks. I never really did one thing at a time. I always did multiple things at the same time. I had a track that sort of followed an academic path, and then I had a track that followed a very non-academic, very corporate and applied path. The top track here, I did a bachelor's and a master's in film and media studies at Copenhagen University. I continued on to do a PhD at Aalborg University in politics and society, but I focused on representation in Danish film. And then I did a little more academic work, which I'll touch on at the very end. Parallel to that, while I was still in school, I started consulting. I worked in what we used to call CSR consulting, corporate social responsibility consulting. Today, most people call it ESG consulting, environmental, social, and governance consulting. For short, what I specialized in is what we call social sustainability. So just like you have environmental sustainability and governance, you also have social sustainability, the sort of S in ESG. And underneath that umbrella, I got extra specialized in what we call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. As I was doing that kind of work, I realized that so much of it focused exclusively on how we operate as a business. How are we handling our suppliers? How are we treating our internal staff? How are we thinking about the social as it pertains to our people? Not a whole lot of discussion or context around the people we serve, the people that are using our products, the places where our products end. And so I specialized even more and started working on these questions, CSR, ESG questions, but as they relate to product development. Where does product go? Who does product affect? That ended up giving me a lot of opportunities to work with consulting for media, tech, and creative industries. So I started my own consultancy and did that for a while. And then during both my PhD work and my consulting work, I realized that there was a whole lot of stuff showing up around this AI stuff. All these products related to filmmaking, related to architecture, related to all these other industries I was working with had to do with AI. And I figured I need to learn more about this. I need to understand how it really works. Nobody's taking me seriously. So I applied to something called the Institute for Public Interest Technology at NYU. And I got into their summer fellowship for mid-level researchers or mid-career researchers. And at the IPIT, the Institute for Public Interest Technology, you learn really quickly and very intensively Python. And you can imagine that was not fun. I would not recommend it, but it did give me a tool that enabled me to understand how people talk about tech and enabled me to work with people I hadn't been able to work with before and better understand what they were trying to explain to me that they were doing. So I stayed working in academia a little bit. I had positions where I taught at Copenhagen University, Roskilde University, Lund University, a few different places. And then I got headhunted by a Fortune 50 to be their director of product ethics and moved to New York. And so I did that. And I put in there that I also sometimes get called thought leader on AI and tech ethics. I mean, we can discuss whether that's really relevant, but sometimes that's where it ends up landing now. I also was lucky enough to be asked to be on the advisory board for the Danish Pioneer Center for AI, so slowly my career kind of transitioned into this much more techie space. Which brings us to the core of my work, product ethics. What is product ethics? Sometimes people call it tech ethics, AI fairness. Sometimes people call it product equity. I would argue that those are subcomponents of the big umbrella product ethics. And usually when we talk about this stuff, we talk about it in terms of non-AI products. And I'm going to give you some gendered examples here, but this could apply to a lot more different things, and I'll show you later what that means. But to begin with, think about an iPhone. Most of you probably have an iPhone. How many people have an iPhone? Wow, a lot of people have an iPhone. It actually kind of even applies to Android, but let's stick with iPhone for now. Have you noticed how they're getting bigger? So there's been a lot of talk about design and gendered design. Some of it argues that when we design, for instance, an iPhone, we design it the size of an average man's hand. Because we've tested it on most men, because the people who've built it are mostly men, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a woman who uses iPhones frequently, I use the old ones. I'm always like a few models behind because they're smaller. And my finger can almost reach all the way across the screen, but mostly I have to use two. So I'm automatically disadvantaged at how fast I work my phone, right? Don't even get me started on pockets. These pants, pregnancy pants, don't even have them. But most pants for women have tiny pockets. So we can't fit our humongous phones anywhere. And of course, this is all fun and games and about design, but it has serious consequences too. We've learned that the way that we test seatbelts in cars disadvantages women because the dummies, the dolls that we use for crash testing, are based on the man's size body, and for that reason, women are more likely to be seriously injured or killed in an accident. So there's plenty of reasons we should be thinking about ethics for business and ethics for products, particularly. If you just talk more generally about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and ESG, environmental social governance work, across businesses, people tend to argue for it from two different perspectives, either the business case or the burning platform. The business case is getting a lot of traction right now, especially in Denmark. We love to talk about like the good reasons we should be doing good, the profitable reasons we should be doing good. It's great for employer branding. We know that the younger generations especially pick their workplace based on whether they're aligned with the ethics and morals of that place. We know that sometimes it matters even more than what they earn. So if you want to attract the growing workforce from the youngest generations, you actually really have to care about these things. We know that it changes your reach and depth in terms of market. Obviously, if you're building products for one type of person, your product might not work as well for the people you're not considering. So there's a real market argument as well. And then there's the curb cut analogy, which we've learned from accessibility research, right? So the curb, the sidewalk that you walk on, if it carves down sort of as a ramp so that you can cross the street, that's very practical for wheelchair users. But it turns out, once you've done it, it also really helps people who are pushing a pram or biking or for other reasons need wheeled accessibility. And this actually happens for a lot of different products. You build a product that is improved for one particular group that was disadvantaged before, and it turns out it works for a lot of different people. So that's sort of the business case side of it. On the other side, we have the burning platform, the risk aversion, doing this because you're really scared. I like to push that a little bit more, just because I like to be a little scary. But the risk aversion side of things really talks about sort of what is the risk to your brand if you were caught doing something that seems unethical or unfair or unjust or not right. What are the risks in terms of legal cases? How much might this cost you? And more, the legislative expectations land over here as well, right? Suddenly, there's actually a minimum requirement. In 2011, we had the first unanimous endorsement by the UN of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the first authoritative framework for social sustainability. And that's the first time everybody agreed this is how we do social sustainability and this is how we measure it. And that has trickled into a lot of now real binding legislation that's coming out, for instance, of the EU. So we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, and the AI Act, all different pieces of legislation that pull from this traditional understanding of social sustainability. So our first lesson from my weird, quirky way into tech is this. There's both a business case and a burning platform for tech ethics, but neither should stand alone. If you're only driven by the business case, chances are you will only improve your product for the groups that are big enough to count from a market interest perspective. At some point, we get so niche that we don't really care about this audience group, this user group, this customer base. So if you're just doing a business case-based approach, chances are someone's still going to get lost at the end. If you're just driving yourself from a burning platform perspective, though, chances are you're going to do the bare minimum standard and requirements, right? You're just going to do compliance. And I think we can probably all kind of align on the fact that you can do everything according to the law and still not be practicing in an ethical way, right? Because the law doesn't always catch up to the different ways that technology develops. Okay, and then when it comes to tech ethics, what kind of ethics are we actually talking about? As I entered into this field of tech ethics and AI ethics, I noticed that people were talking about three things in particular, and they're talking about more, but these are three things that really stood out to me. Privacy, security, and biases. And when they talked about biases, mostly about gender, race, and age. And I was like, these seem familiar to me. There's something that rings a bell. That's right. I used to work in business and human rights. These correlate with human rights. They actually correlate with the right to privacy, the right to liberty and security of person, and the right to non-discrimination. But wait a second. There's 48 human rights. Why are we only talking about 3? So part of what I wanted to do when I started working in this field was try to expand our horizons for how we think about the different impacts our products can have across more than just 1, 2, or 3 human rights. The list that I have here are randomly chosen. I just looked up this morning and took a few that I thought might be interesting for some of the tech products that you might be working with or digital products that you might be working with. But there are more. There are 48, and I highly recommend that you check them out and try and figure out which of them align with the products that you're working on. And your product could be working in aid of or in support of these rights too, right? So this could also be a way for you to better understand the positive impact of your product, but it's also a really good way of understanding the potential adverse impact or risk of your product. Okay, so this brings me back to our exercise from before. And you were all asked to sort of think about an ethical product in the AI ML space. And I will not ask everyone in the room because I don't have infinite time, but I will show you some of the ideas that I often get when I talk to people about what an ethical AI product could look like. Mostly people bring up these types of products. Using AI or machine learning or algorithms for diagnostics purposes. We see more and more of this. Suddenly you can use AI and you can better detect whether a mole might be a high-risk thing or whether you're getting skin cancer or something like that. We've seen them in risk evaluations of abuse, so figuring out whether a kid is at risk of being abused at home, for instance, and needs out-of-home placement or needs to go into foster care. And we've seen it in a much larger scale for mapping globally of places that are hit by poverty, for instance, or famine. These are just some examples of what people think is really ethical AI or ethical uses of machine learning and AI. And would you believe it? They correspond to human rights. So some of the things that they impact, again, bring us directly into this conversation about human rights. The right to health, the rights of children, the rights to family life, right to food, right of life, right to life. So these are things that made me, again, think, okay, so when we talk about good AI and examples of good AI, which again, I'll get to why that's a little bit normative as well, but even when we're talking about that, there's a human rights component that we're kind of missing or forgetting to talk about. So lesson number 2, tech ethics has a lot to learn from business and human rights approaches. If we looked into how business and human rights have leveraged human rights before to evaluate their internal ethics, it'll teach us something about how to evaluate our AI products. When it comes to tech ethics, who are we talking about? That's the next big question. Because very often when I talk about this stuff, people are like, okay, we want it to be more ethical in general. Of course, we want it to be more ethical for all. But is it always necessarily the same for everyone? And that's where these things come in. Grounds for discrimination, we call it in Europe. In the US, they tend to use language like protected characteristics or protected classes. Generally, there's a little bit of overlap. And again, these come very directly from kind of a human rights-based approach, because the right to non-discrimination usually describes exactly who gets protected under that right. And so even though we want to build ethical products for everyone, there are certain groups of people who are historically marginalized in terms of power, access, finance, etc. And those are the groups that we need to be exceptionally wary of when we're building products and we're trying to create fair outcomes. If you just look at the International Bill of Human Rights, these are the grounds for discrimination that they describe. Mind you, the International Bill of Human Rights was written down a good half century ago, so things have changed a little bit since then, and different national contexts will have different requirements. So if you're trying to build a global product and trying to ensure that it doesn't discriminate in different markets, you really have to know about local legislations and protections too. If you just add on Europe and pull a little bit of stuff from the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, we get a few extra groups, like sexual orientation. We also get a little bit poorer protection on some things like nationality if you're outside of the EU and you're not protected as an EU national. So there are certain groups that are sort of protected more or less depending on the context that you're in. And then if you want to get really wild with it, You could look at upcoming legislation, so something that isn't actually a law yet, but just legal discussions. For instance, in the US, the NTIA did a request for comment, and they mentioned all of these different groups as potential groups that required extra protections as we're building law around AI. This doesn't mean that it's arbitrary. It's not like forever growing amounts of groups. It just means that we have to get more and more specialized to understand what types of products might have impacts on which groups of people. And the way that this manifests in real products in real time, we've seen in a lot of different examples. We know from facial recognition research, Joy Buolamwini did a great job with exposing this, that the way that facial recognition software and AI and machine learning products work, they're really biased. And you might think that doesn't really matter, but actually the way we use facial recognition can determine how you cross a border, whether you get predictive policed in a different way. We've already seen arrests of the wrong people. And it also might define whether or not you get to unlock your phone, which is really impractical if you can't do that. And we've learned that facial recognition software does not work as well for women as it does for men. What's more, it doesn't work as well for people of color as it does for white people. And probably the most interesting revelation here is that we need to take what we call an intersectional approach. We need to understand the overlapping disadvantages that happen when you're marginalized in more than one way, because they work the poorest for women of color. It also happens with stuff like algorithmic CV sorting, right? We want it to be more fair in the way that we hire people. You might hypothetically be like, okay, we'll just anonymize CVs when we recruit. You might be like, okay, we don't want a bias in terms of gender when we're recruiting or race, so let's get an AI to remove images and faces and names. And that way we're sure that there's no gender in this data set and we can just look at these CVs completely objectively. So that happened. And what they learned was the outcome was still biased. Women were still not getting as many interviews or getting pulled in as much or evaluated as highly, nor were people of color. They were like, that's weird. Turns out you've trained the AI on data from existing employees, and there's a bias in who you've been hiring. And so the AI will better recognize particular schools, particular clubs, particular sports, whether you're in a women's chess club or a men's chess club, whether you went to a women's college or a men's college, historically black college, etc. And they're like, damn, okay, we'll anonymize one more time and take all that stuff out too. So you do that, and you're like, okay, now we're clean, we're good. Not so much. Turns out, even the way we talk about ourselves, the language we use to describe our successes and our failures, the way that we've been socialized to describe whether we work alone or worked as a team, all of those things shape how we describe ourselves in a CV and impacts how the CV is evaluated. So you cannot fully debias always, and that's part of the lesson here as well. Sometimes there are things that are so deeply embedded in the data that we're not going to be able to fully get there and pull out every part of gender, race, sexuality, disability, etc., as we try to pull through the data. We've seen the same thing with mortgages, where even if you're not trying to ask people for race or data around their racial background, merely the fact that we've had historical segregation, redlining, etc., means that people applying in different contexts were recommended for different levels of mortgages by AI-supported systems. So in that sense, we've seen these inequities appear even in systems where they weren't designed to do it. And so I want us to remember three things. Proxies can be enough for these characteristics and classes to show up in your AI and machine learning products. Even if you do not design your AI or machine learning product to place weight on particular characteristics, one of them could still appear. Biases could still appear. And you have to check for them all. All of those protected classes, the bubbles I showed you before, you have to check for them all, even the ones you think are not relevant for your product. Because even though you think, oh, this type of product, that's not going to be, we're doing a voice AI, it's not going to matter with gender because there's no pictures of women or men and we don't tell them whether it's a female or male voice. pitch affects that. And pitch also affects stuff like age, disability, etc. So, or is affected by. So for that reason, even when you think it's not relevant, it might be relevant. So that's lesson number 3. Understanding protected classes, characteristics, and grounds for discrimination is key. Okay, so what kind of AI products are we talking about? Because I've used examples that are kind of severe, right? Whether or not you get to buy a home, pass a border, kind of high-risk, important cases. But my entry into this was actually through my film background, right? So remember I did a PhD where I looked at film? And all these film-related AI products kept showing up, and I was like, there's something about representation and bias and stuff relating to these types of products too. And if you look at the new AI Act, they do this sort of hierarchized high-risk and low-risk AI stuff. And we're kind of taught to worry the most about what is called high-risk AI. But I would argue that we need to be thinking about low-risk stuff too. Here's why. Take something like deepfake. How many of you know what deepfake is? Okay, the majority. A very simplified version of deepfake. Imagine that you have your favorite celebrity, and that celebrity's digital likeness gets copied and put on top of another person. The terrible cases we've seen already of deepfake have to do with, celebrities getting their likeness used on porn films against their will. But there are plenty of ways you could commercialize deepfake, and it's not very unrealistic that we could do this quite soon, where imagine you're sitting down, you want to watch your favorite movie, but you're really tired of Tom Hanks always being the lead in this movie. And you're like, this would be great with Will Smith. And you can just sort of flip and flop. Whoever you want to watch play the main lead in whatever film you like. You can make it a queer film suddenly. You can make it a film with people of color all of a sudden. It has all of this wonderful potential for diversifying what we're watching, but it also has the risk that you can watch films exclusively with people who look exactly like you. And so, even though it's kind of a harmless, gamified version of this product, it has real ethical implications over time for how we consume media. Same for our recommendation algorithms. These are almost always used as examples of something that's low risk and great, because we all love getting recommendations that actually match our personality, and we get to watch the TV we wanted to watch, and magically my computer knows that I love The Real Housewives. And I love that, that's great. But imagine that these recommendation algorithms over time target people differently based on their race, their gender, their background, their socioeconomic background, education, etc. And then imagine that they serve one group of people high quality, informed information that gives them a broad perspective on the news, on the world, on the state. And then another group just gets low quality information that's biased continually. In that way, something quite harmless, like how we consume media, gets shaped and shapes how we understand the world over time. So I would argue that over time, what we thought was low risk might actually be high risk. We also have machine learning assisted editing tools in the film industry. These are something, I was on a panel with some folks from Google and they were so excited about this happening. And I was like, oh, yeah, let's talk about that. So imagine you can now democratize film. Anyone can be a filmmaker. Suddenly you can use generative AI to shoot the actual film for you. You can use different AI machine learning editing products to color grade it, to set sound to it, to edit your sound. But imagine that all of these tools are trained on our existing body of film, which is skewed and biased for Hollywood, for Western film, for films made by men, for films made by white folks. And for that reason, you're wanting to make a film about the Middle East, let's say. You just get recommended the classic yellow filter, where they sort of filter everything with a yellow color, the way that they do in existing movies about the Middle East, to make it sort of more oriental. Or they sound edit for you, and they accidentally pitch up all the women's voices a little bit, and pitch down all the men's voices, or pitch down all the bad women's voices a little bit, which we've seen from research in Bollywood happen. So imagine these small tweaks, technical skills that you didn't have yourself that you can use from this tool set, but it's biased by the history that our film products have created. That's where we run into risk, even with something that is harmless. So lesson number 4, low-risk AI can be high-risk too. Okay, so let's go back to the exercise from before, because we're safe here. This is the comfortable zone. These are the nice kinds of AI, right? Okay, so if we return to this idea about diagnostics, risk evaluations of abuse, and mapping of poverty or famine, even these ideas that we have for really good, wonderful, happy AI that makes us all feel good in our bellies, the same risks of bias and inequity show up in these products too. With diagnostics, we've seen that diagnostics, AI-driven diagnostics tools are poorer at identifying cancers and skin changes in dark skin. We know that research in medical science has been biased and skewed towards male symptoms over women's symptoms for ages. Of course, that's going to impact how we use AI tools as well. With these risk evaluations of abuse, that's actually a case that we saw here in Denmark. I wrote a policy brief about it recently with 2 of my colleagues, and with these risk evaluations of abuse, what you see is 2 Danish municipalities started using AI-driven risk evaluations for decision support to help people make decisions about whether to place children into foster care, to give them a risk score. And what we saw was you could give 2 exact similar cases, the exact same kind of, they've had the exact same kind of trouble that happened to them. Something bad happened to them, and you get the same report for each of them. But because they have different ages, their risk scores, widely different. Higher risk score for an older kid, lower risk score for a newborn baby. Because the system is trained on data that already exists, and guess what? Older kids are better at reporting, better at telling about their issues, and better at getting a case and getting placed. So the AI replicated that pattern from the data, not knowing that that's just because older kids are better at asking a teacher for help. And so even something as good or well-intended as this case ends up having a biased or skewed outcome. With mapping of poverty and famine, it's the same. We have what we call data scarcity. So the places that are the most vulnerable and the most at risk are the places with the least data, the least tech, and so they're the hardest to map. So we might find an area that's really, really famine-struck or poverty-struck, but we won't be able to find the most marginalized outskirts of those areas because they're not even showing up in the data. So even with all these examples of good uses of AI, we have to be wary that there's still always a risk of unethical outcomes. Even AI for good can be bad, or at least unfair or unjust. All right, so you want to build more socially sustainable products. What can you do today? Product ethics is a continual process, not a check mark, so you have to strategize for long-term solutions. Things like data drift happen, things that change how your algorithm performs over time happen, so you have to be wary that this is not like a point in time where you check in and make sure our products are ethical, we're done, we can move forward. This has to be an ingrained process for how you work. You have to focus on harm reduction first and then philanthropy or social good or positive impact. If you go out and try and create what you think is a positive or well-intended product, but you don't think about the potential harms of that product first, you end up risking really, really bad press because you're marketing yourself with something great that actually had a really unfair, skewed outcome. And then finally, I recommend learning the foundations of impact assessing that aligns with the UNGPs. Again, the UNGPs are the UN, the United Nations, guiding principles on business and human rights. If you can't afford support in that space, because a lot of you are working in startups and smaller tech businesses, familiarize yourself with the human rights. It's free, they're available everywhere. And the grounds for discrimination or protected classes that are relevant to where you're working. That's a really good starting point for what you need to be checking and assessing your product against. And before I go, I wanted to make an acknowledgement because we're talking about tech and we're talking about DTU and the tech space and tech companies. And we play a key part in providing the infrastructure of current war regimes and what's going on with the genocide in Palestine. And it's important for me to recognize that as tech folks, we also have a role to play in how we even deploy our tech and what we participate in. So if we want to be ethical tech folks, it starts with ourselves and where we even want to do our work. Thank you. I'm so sweaty and pregnant. Oh.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk,
Thank
Tess. Let me know if you need more water, for sure.
I probably do.
And in the meanwhile, we'd love to hear if there are any questions here in the room. And we're also going to take questions from the participants online. They can type it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Tess, for a wonderful presentation, eye-opening, I would say, and the correlation with the human rights were like very astute and interesting. But as I also briefly mentioned before the talk, intersectionality, I think, suffers from a dimensionality curse. Like if you want to consider 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 different classes and test a model for its behavior on that from a combinatorial perspective, it just explodes. Which is, I think I've seen very often people who said they've tested for actually a lot of classes, but then when you look at the combinatorial situation, then very often that's where the real issue lies. And I think in many situations where ethical testing has failed, it has been because of that. You forgot to look at a specific subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup. And
right.
So thoughts on what do we do with that? I mean, the models are so complicated with so much input data, and how can we ever, when we know we can't fully test the model?
That's a really, really good question. So there are, depending on your context, a series of grounds for discrimination you should be considering. Even if you're just using the International Bill of Human Rights, we're at about 10. And if you're aiming for an endless combination of those, which is what you should be aiming for because people can be marginalized across all 10 and in different ways, yeah, you do run into sort of challenges sometimes in like how do we make that cross-referential check? I've seen examples where people kind of go for the most marginalized person they can think up. So someone who is marginalized across all 10, and then each of them is a spectrum, not a binary division. So it's not always as easy as that. You can't just say you're testing for women and men. You have to understand the gender spectrum, et cetera. So it's not always that straightforward, but at least if you sort of try to aim for people who are marginalized across multiple different factors at the same time, more stuff will show up than if you're just testing one at a time individually. And so that's where I would start. I would start by saying, figure out ways that, people could be marginalized that you haven't thought about, that aren't on your team, that haven't built the product, but that, could, in theory, use the product. And how do we make sure that we're testing for those who are the most marginalized or potentially most marginalized in those groups? And I mean, it's not an infinite amount, of course, but it is a lot of testing. So yeah, I agree with you, but I would always argue for more testing rather than less.
Thank you.
Yes? Oh, we have a question in the back.
Yes.
So it really seems like it's a foundational issue of AI tools can only, or successful, useful AI tools can only really be built with a strong foundation of just a lot of data. So if AI tools kind of automate and make more powerful the things that already exist that have strong background and a lot of data, a lot of insight to build off of. So if the only foundation we have is this biased, racist, deeply flawed foundation, what can we do except just kind of not build that or not build on it?
That's a really good question too. And sometimes I get in an addendum to that question, people asking about synthetic data. So what happens if we try to generate data that we think is less biased to try and sort of trick the algorithm into producing less biased outcomes? And I haven't seen really convincing examples of how that works yet. But I would say, for me, usually what I try to do is push back on the idea that we even need to build an algorithm or a machine learning solution here, and particularly black box solutions, which we've talked about before lunch as well, this sort of that sometimes we need to stop in our track and wonder whether we're even doing the right thing by building that type of solution in cases where we know that the data is just automatically going to be flawed. And sadly, that happens for a lot of data. And part of what I work with now as well is sort of what are the different ways to increase, like I partner with researchers at ITU who do really interesting work on how do we do more robustness, how do we create more sort of transparency around how we clean data and debias data. But I would argue that you can't really, people who are claiming that their data is unbiased, it really depends on the context, but I would say that's very rare, and it's very rare that I see that that's convincing. So using sort of, this is an unbiased algorithm or this is an unbiased data set usually gets my red flags up. We can debias, we can lower harms, we can try and reduce risk, and we should. We shouldn't give up just because it's really hard. But we also have to be mindful that sometimes AI just isn't the solution. We should abide by the whole techno-chauvinism critique that Meredith Broussard introduces, right? That we should worry when we think tech is the solution to everything.
And we're going to see if there's questions online.
Yes, actually, we have a lot of questions here in the chat, and I don't think that we'll have time for all of them.
Okay.
I'll try to merge some of them and do the best to get you to the chance to answer. So there's Olivia Hesslinger who's asking you, what will you suggest to be the best way for the public to get involved in creating AI in our society? And just to add on that, Maitum Day asked about if there's a language apart Python that you could recommend be used for AI. I don't know if you will be able to answer both of the questions.
Okay, so for programming languages apart from Python, I cannot answer that because I am just not technically gifted enough to know. And I would never try to pretend that I'm an expert enough to do that. For what can we do as a public, like as part of the public, we need to require and push for much harder legislation in this space. We need to, I know they're working really hard in the EU to build so that there's more than just the AI Act. I was just in Brussels, so I'm aware that there's sort of movement in that direction. But we as the public can push for really, really sharp and strict legislation in this space, and we should, because it affects us all, much more than we know and much more than we think about. Familiarize yourself with AI. Look up these cases of biased AI. Read some of these sort of in the books about invisible women, the books about algorithms of oppression, race and technology. There's so many good resources here to get informed about how you are being disserviced, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're marginalized in any way by these algorithms. So that's step number 2, is like getting yourself informed. But I have, so my husband and partner in life is also works in AI at the IT University as well. And he has been pushing for something like a Datatilsyn, but for AI. So an entity that actually controls for and checks the impacts of AI on a public level in Denmark. And I think that would be a really interesting idea as well. But I can't pass it off as mine, so.
Thank you so much, Tess. This has been super informative.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate your time here.